Hey everybody, thanks for making the time to join these sessions. Um, Over the next several sessions, we're going to be talking about the OpenIAM Workforce Identity Solution. The Workforce Identity Solution covers your identity governance capabilities, your join and remove relievers, your access manager, and a little bit of privilege access as well. So in this first session, we're going to be really focusing on how to install uh, the OpenIAM product using an RPM distribution. Okay. So as I mentioned before, this is going to be a series. I think there's about 10 sessions which are planned. We're going to start with installing, from an RPM file. Then we'll spend about 3 sessions really talking about application onboarding and the join and remove relievers use cases. So this is your automated user lifecycle management. We'll then talk about contractor management. We'll move on to request approval workflows, access certification, and in the last few sessions, we'll talk about, how to set up adaptive auth, NMFA, how to configure, a single sign-on using federation. We'll cover both how OpenIAM can act as a service provider and as an IDP. And finally, we'll talk about how we can customize, OpenIAM in terms of some of the branding and some of the other capabilities which are there. For the session today, the format that we're going to follow, we're going to, have briefly talk about what the OpenIAM Workforce IAM product looks like. We'll then move a little bit on to the logical architecture, followed by the deployment architecture options, and then we'll spend some time actually installing the product, and we'll talk about some various things that go with it. So as I mentioned before, the Workforce IAM solution really made up of 3 components, and the privilege access part was really being added in the 4.2.2 release. It's not part of the current release, which is the 4.2.1.3. So the identity governance part really covers all of your automated lifecycle management, your join and remove relievers. There's some tools that supported things like your birthright access and the workflows, the access certification capabilities. We'll also at some point talk about some of the new capabilities that have been added in the 4.2.2 release, which will be there in the end of March, early April. So this will include things like segregation of duties, identity verification, machine identity, and also the new dashboard and monitoring capabilities that have been added. I mentioned earlier, the Access Manager is really focused on federation, with like SAML, OAuth, and OIDC support. There's also reverse proxy, which covers, it basically supports SSO into legacy applications. There's MFA options as well, adaptive authentication to kind of tie everything together. And as part of this, we'll also talk about the just-in-time provisioning capabilities. The privileged access manager is a new component that will be released shortly after the core release goes out, and this will kind of provide some basic PAM capabilities. This is going to be, covering how to onboard machines, discover accounts, do password rotations, and also do some session recording and playback. We're not trying to become, um, you know, a, 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 a full-blown PAM solution. There's already a few on the market. This is meant to be a little bit more limited, but kind of cover core capabilities. Okay. This next slide just kind of talks a little bit about what the logical architecture looks like within OpenIAM. So if you look at the bottom of this diagram, there's this layer called shared services, and this is like a common architectural layer that it basically covers the core capabilities that are needed across the entire stack. So this is your infrastructure components such as RabbitMQ, which is the messaging bus, which all services communicate with. There's a distributed cache, which is Redis. There is Elasticsearch, which is the search engine, which is used. Elasticsearch will be getting replaced with OpenSearch due to a licensing change from Elasticsearch. There's a Vault, which is HashiCorp's Vault, which will also eventually be getting replaced because HashiCorp got bought by IBM, and there's a license change there as well. And then there are services that OpenIAM provides, like the user management and the authorization engine and audit. These are all common to the entire platform, so there was no reason to really to replicate these, across the board. And then on top of that, we add specific services around identity governance. So these are, all of your common use cases, right? The things that we just talked about in the previous slide. And then there are services for access management as well. And then the UI is common across the board. So the goal here is that different customers may have different needs. They may want to start at different places. And with this model, you don't have to turn on all the services that you need for everyone. You can target what your needs are and be able to deploy that part of OpenIAM to be able to consume it. And then as your needs change, to be able to adopt other parts of it without having to do a full-blown deployment to be able to handle this. The other part of this is that we also want to be able to target, well, we'll talk about this in a second about the deployment, how we can deploy. Right? So there's a question that was raised, will federation be covered in the training? Which IDP and SP will be used? Yes, so we will be covering federation. We'll be covering it from two scenarios. So one scenario is going to be OpenIAM acting as an IDP, and we'll be connecting a service provider to it. So it'd be a SAML-based application that will wire together. In another case, OpenIAM will become a service provider to an IDP, and we will use Azure for it, not largely because we have it in our environment, and I would say a majority of our customers are using that as well. But the concept should carry over really to any SAML-based IDP. We'll also cover more focused cases like just-in-time provisioning, and some of the things that we can do in that use case as well. Okay. Okay. So going back to our deployment and what options we have. So previously we just talked about what the architecture looks like, right? It's largely a collection of services, and we can deploy these services both on-prem or in the cloud. When we say on-prem, it really is your data center of choice. So either it could be literally your in-house data center that you manage, whatever means you want, or it could be, Azure, AWS, or Google Cloud. I think we also have a customer that's running this on Oracle Cloud. So there's some flexibility in terms of how we can do things there. And then within that context, you can have really two types of deployments. You can have an RPM style deployment, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in these training sessions, just because in the past we focused on Docker, and really for production use, most of our customers are either using a Kubernetes deployment or they're using RPM because we don't recommend using Docker Swarm, right? So, so we have the RPM style deployment, and then we also have the Kubernetes deployment. And Kubernetes can be cloud native, which means, you're using AWS or Azure, you're using the, as an option, some of the cloud platform services, like for example, the database, the Azure, the Redis cache. If it's AWS, you could be using OpenSearch, right? So you could be using Cassandra or Janus Graph, right? So there's, depending on the cloud provider you use, the infrastructure will be different, but you can use those services if you want, right? But if you're running in-house, you may not, you won't have those kind of services, right? Um, and there's a question that says, I came in a bit late. Will this be and subsequent webinars be made available? Yes, we will be recording. This is being recorded. It'll be published later on today. We have a channel on YouTube where this will go to. There's also a new community portal which has been made available over the weekend, and we'll be publishing it there. Um, okay, so within Kubernetes, we have some variations, right? We have the cloud native, but we also have Rancher, which is fairly popular. So there's some customers started to use OpenShift. We have some VMware customers who are using Tanzu. So all of those we have deployed and tested on, and you can pick and choose which one works best. Tanzu and OpenShift tend to be, you know, there's some nuances there which is require, a little bit more effort. But again, if that's something that you want to do, we can certainly, talk about it and provide some details around what we had to do differently to be able to support it. Yeah. All right, so this next slide kind of talks a little bit about, a very scale down implementation of OpenIAM. And this is the architecture that we're going to be using for these training sessions, right? So basically OpenIAM is installed on one Linux instance. There is a Windows connector, which is being used to talk to things like AD and Entra ID. And then there are maybe on-prem connectors, right? So, and the reason why the on-prem connectors are separated out from the cloud, platform is that this is probably going through over a site-to-site VPN, and the access to the cloud may be a little bit less restricted, right? So this is the reason why the diagram breaks it out. So this next slide just basically talks about the same model, except now we've kind of introduced a platform service, right? In this case, we're assuming this is on Azure, and we're using the Redis cache, and we're using the database service, right? So we moved some things out of this one box and moved them out. And this is one of the flexibility, the flexibility that's there in the RPM deployments is that we can move these things around. You can do this within the Kubernetes world as well. I mean, so you're not really limited, but that's the whole service-based architecture, which allows us to kind of move things around, right? And then we take the whole thing and we kind of say, well, if you wanted to make it an HA deployment, again, we're not using any platform services here. We have 3 nodes on the OpenIAM infrastructure and services, and we have a cluster on the database side. I often get questions about, why do we need 3 nodes? Why not two? And the answer really isn't something that we dictated. It was the fact that we're using components like Redis and Elasticsearch and RabbitMQ, and all of those components require a 3 node infrastructure for high availability. So by default, that became our minimum setup for an HA deployment, right? So there's a question that says, what is the meaning of Redis? Sorry, I should have explained this a little bit better. Redis is a is a product. It is a in-memory distributed cache. Um, it's fairly popular. And similarly, Elasticsearch is a search engine, which is also fairly popular. Similarly, like the vault that we use is HashiCorp's vault, which is also a fairly popular, solution. If you Google Redis, you'll find, a link to their website, and there's detailed documentations on how it can be used. Um, in OpenIAM, we use it in 2 different ways. It's used both as a as an object cache, right? Also things for session, but we also use it with Hibernate as part of the object relational mapping layer, and kind of go from there, right? Um, it says the next one, how can we submit proof of learning to use this for CPE? Just drop us a note separately and we can talk about that. Right? Okay. The next slide, just again, this is again looking at an HA deployment. So we have some large deployments where we're exceeding 50,000 users in headcount. We have a large number of systems that we're integrating with. In those cases, we have separated out the layers to be more scalable and to improve performance. So in this architecture, we have 3 nodes in the UI. We've got 3 nodes in the OpenIAM layer. We've got a database cluster. And we took the infrastructure components, Redis, RabbitMQ, Vault, Janus Graph, Elasticsearch, moved them off to their own separate cluster. Right? With that said, let's transition over to the actual installation. So a few things to note about the system requirements. So the RPM install really needs a Red Hat flavored Linux OS. This is Red Hat Linux 9 Plus. It could be Rocky Linux, it could be Alma Linux, or CentOS 9 Stream, right? You should have 8 CPU cores for the RPM. For like a POC, we recommend a minimum of 48 gigs of RAM. and the disk is about 40 gigs. I often get questions about why the memory requirement's so high. Um, and part of it has to do with the default configurations on some of the components like Redis and Elasticsearch and so on and so forth. They've been configured to be usable out of the box for at least a small customer. And in the process, the memory requirements got pushed up. And I know quite a few people have kind of pushed back on it. So from 422, there will be templates that we will provide going from POC, small, medium, large, and an enterprise deployment. And those will provide some default memory settings, CPU settings as well, and disk. And it will allow you to, at least get started in less than 32 gigs in that default, configuration. Okay. The steps that we're going to follow, and we're literally going to be cutting and pasting commands from the documentation to get this thing up and running. And I do that on purpose just because if we can't do that, then what was the point of the documentation, right? So, but at high level, we're going to basically download and install the RPM file. We're going to initialize, the install, and then we're going to see that it came up, and we're going to get the application up and running. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to see at this point my terminal window. I've already connected into the Linux host. Let's just confirm that some of the basic things that we're looking for, the memory, we have enough, and we do. Let's just bring up my docs. So we have plenty of CPU capability here as well. And then we're just going to check the OS. And these steps that I'm going through um, are things that we find that oftentimes people who say that they're not able to install, oftentimes they're trying to install this thing on a VM with 8 gigs of RAM, one CPU, a little disk space, and on startup the system, it crashes, right? So uh, the minimum requirements really are minimum requirements. They need to be there. So next thing, let's download the RPM file, and we're gonna install 4213, which was just pushed out at the end of last week. So we're just gonna use the curl command to bring down the URL, the RPM file. We're going to install that RPM file. I forgot a step. Sorry about that. One of the things that is needed is we need tar to be here to be able to deal with this. So let's install that. Let's go back and now, install this, and now it should work. Okay, so as part of this, the system is going to make some changes to the I think it's the U limits. It's going to reboot the VM. So let's just shut that down, and okay, we'll give that a second. This question here, can the deployments only be done on Linux? Is it possible for Windows? Unfortunately, the core part of OpenIAM is a Linux-friendly product. It will only run on Linux. So if you're going to use containers, you have flexibility, a little bit more flexibility in the flavor of Linux. But you know, um, the only part that runs on Windows are the connectors for basically Microsoft. Okay, let's see if this came back. Okay, so we're back up, so ready to go to the next step. Um, okay. So we install the RPM. At this point, we're going to initialize the system. So there's a command line utility called OpenIAM CLI. It's very helpful with a lot of RPM related operations. So first thing is going to ask you if you have internet access or not. Some of our customers, especially in very lockdown environments or in the government space, they do not have internet access. So the RPM install is fully contained, and so there is an option where we could have downloaded a couple other files, and in which case it would have, we could run this thing without having internet access. In this case, I do, so I'm going to say yes, and it's going to start downloading some of the other files. This process takes a little bit. So the question is, will the slides be made available? Yes, we'll be publishing this later on today, and in addition to the video, the slides that we use will also be there as well. This is second question is if I want to make a lab in my desktop, what do I need? It's covered pretty much in the minimum requirements I would recommend. That's just taking a look at the RPM installation docs and what's required. So you'll probably need a Linux VM to be able to contain this and kind of go from there, right? Okay, so in this case, you have choices in which database we can use. We have the option to install MariaDB, and for a POC, this is fine. Yeah, you can also use Postgres, you can use Oracle or SQL Server. And my recommendation, usually when people ask me like which database we should use, my preference is that you should use a database that you have, if you have an infrastructure internally for it. So if you have DBAs already who are, and you're supporting a certain type of database, then I would use that because you already have the infrastructure to be able to manage it. So in this case, I'm going to say yes, go ahead and install MariaDB. This one trips people up. It says enter the current password for root, um, enter for none. At this point, the way MariaDB works, there is no password for root. So just leave a blank, hit enter, and then say yes, you want to set the root password. And now go ahead and set the password in that you want. Okay, and for security, yes, you should remove anonymous users. You should disallow root login remotely and remove the test database, right? Reload the privilege tables, and then it will continue. At this point, it's going to generate a certificate so that it can initialize the vault. The etcd that you're seeing here is starting. Etcd is the storage for the vault. In 422, um, the vault will be the same for RPM and um, for Kubernetes deployments. It will be console, right? The question is, do the minimum requirements include what is needed for the MariaDB? Yes, it does. Yeah. So if you use the default settings, you'll be fine just to get this up and running. Okay, the next part, the system's gonna start, generating the schema inside MariaDB. So now there are two schemas in that you'll see, regardless of which database you use. It's going to be one is called OpenIAM, the other one is going to be called Activity. The OpenIAM schema is really all things related to OpenIAM, and Activity is the workflow engine that we use, and it will create a separate schema for that. So in this case, let's just use the defaults and I would say unless you're doing a production install or you're familiar with how OpenIAM works, just stick with the defaults. At least you get up and running. You know, and again, username. Yeah, this is RabbitMQ is the message broker that all the services talk to. Again, this is Redis, and yeah, let's just keep going. All this looks correct, and we keep going from there. And we should literally be done with this part in a couple of minutes. So here it's going to start up Cassandra, and you'll see an ugly error come up in the beginning. Ignore it. It just means that Cassandra is not up yet, and the installer is checking to see if it's up, and it failed the first time around, and then after that, you should be fine. That's the ugly error message I was telling you about. And it says waiting for Cassandra, and that was because Cassandra is not up yet. And just for reference, Cassandra is, you can think of it as the storage for Janus Graph. So this is where we keep all the hierarchical information. So the relationships between the entitlements and it allows us to kind of navigate and be able to do lookups a little bit faster. So at this point, it's setting up Elasticsearch. Okay, it's moving out the rabbit in queue, and okay. So all the core components are up at this point, and the schema the has been created, but there's nothing in the schema at this point. And so we use Flyway within the product. Flyway is a database schema versioning tool. It helps us both in making sure that all the scripts are run, but it also helps us when we do upgrades to know from what point to what point the scripts need to be applied, right? So in this case, it's going to say, let's go with the default. The schema is empty. And we pick the defaults earlier on what the database names are. So we can just go with them here as well. And this is why I said just keep it. So if you're using MariaDB, then it's actually MySQL that you'd pick here. And oh, I screwed this up. This is gonna fail. Good. Um, and I'm gonna say no because I did screw this up. And okay, let's try this again. Go to the default here. Okay. The schema files are getting centered. So the question is, can all this be scripted so that we don't screw it up? Yes, you can. So you don't have to do what I'm just doing right now. And since I've done this one too many times, of course, I'm not going to read every prompt and make the mistakes that I just did. But yes, we can script this out, and we can talk to our DevOps team to provide details on how we can script this and automate this process. So the next part is, do you if you want to install the reverse proxy module. So the reverse proxy is like this. I'm going to say yes, and I'll talk about it in a second. Um, so there is a small plugin, a native C plugin into the Apache web server, which is what we call the reverse proxy. It has two real objectives. One is that it sits in front of OpenIAM, the application, and it protects it by enforcing the access control rules around how you access the UI. But it also enables SSO to legacy applications. Many customers won't need that second part, but uh, you will need it to kind of protect this part, right? So the reason why we give you the option is it's like you may not want to install it on that same box. You may want to put it on another box and maybe even use it to kind of load balance across, right? So that's the reason why it's there. Um, yeah. So the question is the word proxy like Force IG? Conceptually, yes, it is. You know, in many ways, it plays a similar role. Okay, so while this is installing, we're going to use the OpenIAM CLI and we're going to ask for the status. You know, and right now you can see that things are still starting up. Um, and the UI always takes the longest time. All the other services are, well, the IDM service is still coming up. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and just create a little bit of space. Now, while we're doing that, the OpenApp CLI, it has a few other capabilities. Like, so for example, if you just type in CLI like that, you can get the full list of options that you want. Um, you see that part that says auto init? That's kind of where we can introduce a script, you know, to be able to automate these steps, right? So there is a hook in here for it, and we can definitely provide you details for it. If you wanted to see the logs, for example, so let's say we want uh, CLI, we can see logs, and then let's just say we want to log to the OpenIAM UI, but it's still starting up, right? So you can see what's going on, and this is going to help you from time to time when you want to be able to troubleshoot. Okay? So as soon as that UI starts up, we can move on to the next few steps. Actually, while we're doing that, let's go talk about a couple other things. I know this came up. Oh, the question was, again, if I can show the last command, how we can check the logs. So simple format. So OpenApp CLI, you can go to log, right? And then the service name. So the service names are any one of these, right? So if we take, say, for example, synchronization, we can say that, right? And you'll see the logs for that service. Okay. Can we change the log levels? Yes, we can. So let's see one thing, if I remember correctly, where they are. So first of all of these files, and we added this to the documentation literally yesterday, is, is the file structure. So we can go to here. This is where all of the files are installed, okay? And you'll see that, for example, in the environment.conf, all of the settings that we've been working with are basically captured here. Okay. And the question about the log levels is right here, the OpenIAM log level. So you can change this from trace to info to debug. There's a couple other options there that you can change this to. Okay. Other things that are in here, which are relevant, the logs. If you go to the logs, you will see all of the logs that we can access with that command line utility. You can see them here as well without going through that CLI. Okay. Same thing. So under the conf directory, you'll find under IAM scripts, these are all the Groovy scripts that we provide out of the box across the board. And properties has, if I can only type, the various properties for the different components. So for example, the data source, Elasticsearch. So for example, if we wanted to look at how Redis is configured, we can go in here and take a look at that, right? So that being said, at this point, I would expect that my install is done. I should get a clean status. Yep, everything's up and running. I can confirm that with one more check. I can do a curl command. And if this looks good, then I know with some certainty that things are going well. Okay. Um, okay, so now that we're up and running, let's shift gears to the UI. Okay. Okay, let's just go to a new tab and at this point, let me go grab the IP address where this thing is installed. So we're going to go through a first-time login, right? So the credentials are in the docs, but it's sysadmin PASSWD00. And at this point, it's going to ask you to change them. So you see on the side here, this is the out-of-the-box default password policy, right? Obviously, you're going to change this as part of the things that we do. And then the next thing is it's going to ask you to set up a content provider. The content provider, the naming trips everybody up. You can think of it as basically an alias for a domain or an alias for a realm, right? And it's a very flexible or an important concept in OpenIAM because linked to this content provider are going to be your authentication policies, your branding, and a few other things that we're going to do, right? So in this case, it should have picked up the location of your server is. The application servers, these are where my services live. And I want to support both HTTP and HTTPS because I'm going to turn this on a little bit later. And at this point, I'm going to set up the content provider. It's going to basically do some default work to get things set up. It's going to build the cache, and then it's going to log me into the admin interface. Okay. And before that, it's going to ask me to set out these challenge questions. And again, when you can, turn these things on and off later on based on how you want this to be configured. Okay, so we're in. The last thing that we want to do for our session today is we want to set up SMTP. So the question is, if I choose HTTP only, am I able to connect to OpenIAM, connect the OpenIAM to Enter ID? Yes. So we will actually do this in one of the later sessions. We will make OpenIAM a service provider to Enter ID. So Enter ID will be the IDP, OpenIAM will become the service provider. Um, but I would recommend that you want HTTPS turned on for any real use because even after you federate through it, you don't want your traffic flowing between your proxy layer and your backend layers in clear. You should protect it unless you've got other guardrails around it and you really don't, want to go down that path, right? So in this case, we're going to go to administration. We're going to go to mailbox configurations. And there's a default one in here. It's just using Google as the SMTP gateway. We use Office 365, so I'm going to set up a setting here for that, right? And I'm going to say, um, what are you going to call it? Right? I'm going to say it's active. And then there's a couple parameters that we need to put in. So we want to put in the sender name, where these emails are going to come from. So we're going to say that. It's no reply to at openam.com. And the prefix is going to be okay, and then we're going to use the username, also the same thing here. Now, if this was any other SMTP setting, what I'm doing is fine. And however, for Office 365 itself, what I'm doing is not really the right way of doing it. You really should use modern auth to turn this on. And then there's a bunch of things you need to do to register the app with Entra ID, and then it's going to give you a client ID in secret. Like say, for example, if we did this, right? And then you would define these. It's basically using OAuth, and you would configure this as a client for OAuth and do that, right? But so just keep that in mind that if you're using, Office 365, don't do it the way that I'm doing it. Do it the right way, which is to use the OAuth part, right? And probably somebody in your company will not let you do it anyway. So second part down here, you see a failover mailbox configuration. This is in case your SMTP gateway goes down, right? And so there's a template, and then I want to use a template. This is like your predefined configurations. It tells you where, all your host settings are and things like that. I'll show you, how that's set up. And so let's go ahead and save this. And if all of this looks okay, I'm going to send a test message to myself, test. Right? And in a couple of seconds, I should see, oh, what did I not do? She got um, username. Active. Let's see, what did it not like? Oh, thank you very much. Thanks. Okay. I'm really losing it today. All right. Let's save that again. And okay, that worked. So thanks so much for your help with that. Um, all right. So um, that takes care of what we had planned for our session today. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Um, so the question is, if both primary and failover go down, we'll queue it and deliver the messages. Um, I'm pretty sure that it gets stuck in RabbitMQ at that point. I'll double check because I know when it will come up, the queue will try to flush itself out. But I'll confirm that. But I'm pretty sure that it will. Because even if you don't have a backup set up, it's going to put it in there, right? Um, the question was, what about licensing and support? Are there any specific questions about licensing and support? If not, you can always just send us a note and we can, that's fairly easy to answer. So the type it's a annual subscription. It's based on a number of identities. There it also take into account which module you want, and then based on that, we there's a price to it. So in terms of the cost of the subscriptions, I prefer that you just reach out to us because we can rather address it based on your specific needs. This question is why wasn't I able to create metadata types? We're going to cover the metadata types in the next session and how they work, right? Regarding logging, which item gets all the logging information and how long is it kept in terms of days? Okay, so good question about the logging. Everything that we've been doing so far, which isn't a whole lot, is kept right here in the log viewer. And the logs are kept inside Elasticsearch, and they're kept by default. It's really indefinite. It's for us to kind of decide how long we want to keep them. And most customers want at least a couple of years online. There is a scheduled task that will run that will basically um, you could tell it what period of time do you after which you don't want the detailed logged messages, right? Um, so um, basically that scheduled task can run and it will remove all of these small things like sending email notifications and saving security answer, these type of things which are not really audit messages, but they're more like tracing and debugging. It will kind of collapse, kind of remove them from the system. And then what you'll be left with are the audit related events, right? So that can stay for a while, and then it can kind of push this out. Right? Second question is, I saw file properties with clear passwords. There isn't a crypto. Actually, those are all loaded inside the vault. So after they're loaded in there, you can remove that file if you want to, because it's the vault which is actually holding that information. That was just used during the whole startup process. Right? Okay, there's a, just a quick note. If you have a question, just post it. You don't need to raise your hand. I'll answer it as we go. Um, can the alerting be routed via ServiceNow? Um, The integration that we have with ServiceNow is not so much for alerting, it's more for raising tickets. Um, but one of the things that you could do is the alert triggers off a email notification. Um, you could have that email notification be changed to a mailbox that ServiceNow monitors, and ServiceNow can pick up that ticket, format it, and parse it out, and create a ticket within itself. So if you wanted to do it that way, you could using just the whole mailbox monitoring part that ServiceNow offers. Okay, if there's no other questions, appreciate everybody's time and all the questions that have been asked. We will clean this up and get it published later on today, and we'll see you next on Thursday. Thanks so much, everybody, for your time.